Hey there, and welcome to the Oscars Death Race podcast, where we try to watch all the Oscar nominated movies or die trying. My name is Paulo, and I'm your host. Hope you're doing well out there. What you're about to listen to is an interview I conducted with director Austin Lee Bunn of the short film Campfire for the third annual Academy of Death Racers Film Festival. In Campfire, a married dairy farmer travels to a gay campground in rural northeast Pennsylvania to search for the man he fell in love with 30 years before, and discovers that the past is not quite done with him yet. In this interview, I talked to Austin about where the short film came from, the logistics of filming in an operating clothing optional campsite, and his decision to make Campfire a hybrid narrative documentary short film. We also dig in a bit more into his past body of work, including the short film In the Hollow and the feature-length film Kill Your Darlings, which starred Daniel Radcliffe and Dane Haan as founding members of the Beat Generation literary movement, and how he has a penchant for writing about queer and counterculture themes set in nature, contrary to most typical depictions. Campfire is currently playing alongside 60 other short films at the Academy of Death Racers Film Festival from January 5th through the 21st. Tickets are still available at the time of this interview going live, so be sure to tune in to check out all of the shorts, including 9 shorts shortlisted for the Academy Awards. Check it all out, including Campfire, while you still can at AoDR.net, linked below. And be sure to tune into the Academy of Death Racers YouTube channel for more illuminating interviews with other directors and filmmakers. Without further ado, let's dive into the spoiler-filled interview with Austin Bunn. So joining me is the director, writer, producer, everything of the short film Campfire, which is a special presentation film for the Academy of Death Racers Film Festival. Austin Lee Bunn. He is the associate professor at Cornell in the Department of Performing Arts and Media Arts, as well as the director of Milstein Program in Technology and Humanity there. He has a number of short films and also a feature film as well, which he co-wrote called Kill Your Darlings, which featured Daniel Radcliffe and Dane Haan. He has, like I said, multiple short films. He's done screenplays, pilots, audio monologues, fiction, nonfiction. He's done it all basically, and we're honored to have him for this Q&A for the Academy of Death Racers Film Festival. Thank you for joining us, Austin.
Paulo, happy to be here.
All right, so let's just go ahead and just hop straight in talking about Campfire. So why don't you tell me, how exactly did this project get started?
Campfire begins as a documentary. So I had this idea to make a documentary about this gay campground that exists in northeast Pennsylvania, north of Scranton. There are about 30-some gay campgrounds around the country. Some of them are LGBT. It sort of depends. And they were a phenomenon of the 80s, really, 80s and 90s, as kind of refugee or sanctuaries for people from the cities dealing with HIV and AIDS. The campground still exists and they still thrive. There are new ones opening every year. It's a little bit of a kind of phenomenon. And this one outside of Scranton called Hillside is near where I live. I'm in Ithaca, teaching at Cornell, as you mentioned. And I found myself really drawn to the place. It's full of characters. These are people who decide to sometimes buy an RV or rent. And the RVs are parked in the woods. There's something like about 300 maybe permanent residents who go to the campground over the summer. In the era of COVID and remote work, some people just stay there. It's almost like a summer home in the mountains. So I had started going, meeting all these people. I decided to make a documentary in the spring of 2022. And then in about June, I was underway in production. And I was doing all these interviews, but to be really honest, Paulo, I didn't know what the story was going to be. I couldn't figure out how to shape a narrative out of this parade of really interesting people. And I got this weird phone call from this man who introduced himself as a friend of my father's when they had been in the military together in the late 50s. My dad was in the Air Force. He worked on this top security base in Louisiana called Bozer Base. And this man said to me, listen, your dad and I were lovers for 2 years while we were in the military in the Air Force. Now, I should tell you, like, my dad died in 2018. This isn't really a conversation I could have with him. The only way the man found his way to me was because he had read my dad's obituary. But he wanted somebody to know that this had happened. And I had a lot of mixed feelings. I have a brother and a sister. They didn't even believe me, that they thought this guy was maybe lying for some reason. But I decided to put those questions that I had kind of into the movie. And a story shaped itself out of some of the stories I had heard from men who had gone to Hillside, guys who had been married. It's in a really agricultural, rural area. So you see a broad range of people there, some guys from the city, some people from agricultural communities around that area. And I decided to sculpt a story, a composite, basically, character from the men I had interviewed. And he is a person who is in search of a long lost love. And that gave me a way to braid together all the interviews that I had done into some kind of story shape. So that's the biography of it. And then I shot the film in the summer of 22 in August, spent last fall editing it, and took it to film festivals this year, this spring and through the summer.
Wow, that is quite the story, right? Especially kind of like this from beyond the grave, right? Kind of like ghost almost, right? So, I was gonna ask, right? I was gonna ask, your a lot of your past works have kind of veered in that in between, right? Of some have been full documentaries, some have been more narrative based on documentary. This veers that line, and kind of you answered my question I was gonna have of, was this based on a true story? It sounds like not a one specific story, but kind of like that aggregate story, like you said, especially tying back to your father.
Yeah, people have commented on that quite a bit, especially at festivals. I had this one German woman saw the film and came out of the screening and said, I found your film really irritating. And I think what she meant was thought provoking, partly because of that blend of fiction and nonfiction in the movies. I was a journalist for about a decade after I graduated from college. I worked as a magazine journalist. I've always really loved journalism and nonfiction. So I found myself, as I moved into film, thinking about true stories and wanting to work with true stories. So Kill Your Darlings, like you mentioned, is a true story. It's based on a true story about the Beat Generation writers. And the short docs that I've made have explored this, as you said, kind of in between place. In the Hollow is a film about a shooting on the Appalachian Trail, and I used really extensive recreations. Almost, I called them conjurings, which might be a little pretentious, but the idea being they weren't supposed to be like a Lifetime movie, like flash cut to an act of violence, but really had its own narrative shape and catharsis in it. And I have to say, I really enjoy editing. So I am finding myself, as I'm making the film, starting to think about how are these things going to contact each other and how will they connect. One of the things I'm most proud of in Campfire is you're watching this narrative film, then you see some documentary elements, and then things start to get even increasingly blurry. Like we started shooting a fictional element during a non-fictional real party. Most of the actors are non-actors who are just guys at the campground. And then at the end of the film, some of the characters from the documentary come into the fiction film in a way that hopefully feels delightful and unexpected. So yeah, I should say that I just find there's a lot of interesting terrain there. There are a number of other filmmakers working in this area. You might know Robert Greene. I don't know if Procession was nominated for an Oscar, but it's an amazing documentary that's on Netflix. Casting John Bonet also is great. Kelly Green's documentary about the John Bonet murder, and others. Of course, Nomadland is probably my primary point of contact as
Okay.
Death Racers. You guys might be familiar with that Oscar winner from a few years ago, where it was a character set in a real environment with real people, and that Chloe Zhao's interest in blending these forms was really inspiring to me.
Right, it's what they say, right? There's always a grain of truth in every fiction, and then sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. Sometimes, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But I haven't seen all of those films. I'll definitely make sure to go check those out. One thing that I was curious, right? So you mentioned that they were all, they were non actors. I looked up Hillside, right, when I saw it in the film. I said, oh, it's like a real campsite, like you mentioned. Were there any logistical issues with filming? I know it's a clothing optional site, so
Yeah.
were there like special like logistical directing things you had to get cleared in order to be able to film in there?
Yeah, Paulo, I'm glad you asked. That's a really good question. So the campground has had this longstanding policy against cameras for good reasons. Partly that's about privacy. People who went there wanted to be able to just kind of be themselves and self-express and not feel self-conscious. And so cameras are forbidden. On the other hand, times have changed. The campground's been around a long time. Pretty much everybody's got a cell phone with a camera on it. So there is a lot of photography happening there and filming going on. And the campground itself makes everybody sign a form as you enter that permits the campground to use to do some photography and filming for their own purposes. And when I started to negotiate around making the documentary, I met with the primary camp administrator, whose name is Wayne. He's in the film. He was obviously concerned, but we were able to agree that the way that people have to sign this form gave me permission to, I wasn't trying to make a tell-all about the campground. I was trying to show it what it's like there. So he saw an alignment and an opportunity to let me do the photography and filming. There's one funny irony here too, Paulo. I would say that when I started filming the documentary with a cinematographer from New York, Rand Rosenberg, who was great, people were really resistant. Like if we showed up at the pool or we were just walking around with the camera, people were not excited to see it. They sometimes felt like they might be exposed. A lot of people there are still in the closet, or maybe, feel like this identity of being a gay person is very private to them. They don't know what I'm going to do with this footage. But then when I started making a fiction film and hanging the documentary material off of it, people were totally fine. They were totally fine to be naked on screen and totally fine to show up at the party. So I think being in a fiction film gave them permission to sort of say, oh, well, I'm just playing a character. Like this isn't actually me. And that was very freeing, and in a way was partly the success of the story. It just allowed me to think about it. You guys, I'm telling a fictional story. Don't worry. I'm not trying to, get you in trouble at all, or, get you in trouble at work or something. So yeah, that's how that worked out.
Yeah, did you have to go back and let people know that, hey, like you're in this cut basically, or like the logistics of all that?
So I think I've made enough films at this point that you learn you've got to get people to sign agreements to let you put them on screen before they're on screen.
Okay.
That helps a lot. So all the documentary material, people signed away the permission for me to use their likeness.
Okay.
Then there were some group scenes where we put up filming signs. So anybody who showed up theoretically saw that sign and therefore was giving permission by being present. And then the last part of that was we filmed on some public events, like there's a big party that happens every year at Hillside called Illumination Weekend. And I decided to we did production during that weekend because I knew that party would happen and we would put it in the film. And because that was at night and people are filming with their cameras all over the place, it really wasn't nearly the same issue. And it's also a night of performance. People are, doing shows, and there's a pole dancer in the middle of the woods. So they don't mind being observed. It's like, that's what they're doing it for. And so there were like 3 different modes that I had to kind of walk. Sometimes we had to let people know in advance. Sometimes we got them to agree and show up and, play a role. And then lastly, sometimes people were just performing and they were totally comfortable with being on screen, being filmed.
So you mentioned, right, like, obviously some people, they're not out necessarily. And that's kind of like the main character here, played by, I think, Mark Rowe, right? Who's straight from
That's right.
Thing. And, his character is one who's not out, right? He has a family, it seems like, right? He's a dairy farmer, has a family. He's not being entirely truthful with them where they are at during this weekend. What was, obviously this ties back, I think, I would guess that this ties back to perhaps your father, right? How he, you didn't really know this about him until after he had passed. So, and then the other thing I found interesting was, obviously, right, there are, like he goes to the man store, right, which I believe is an actual store on there.
Yes.
He buys the harness, right, and then he gets angry at some point. It was like, this is all about sex for you guys, right? So he's obviously not in the lifestyle quite as much, and he's still grappling with his own, homosexuality or LGBTQ-ness, right? How did that character more develop, right? Like, what was the choice? Because at the end, he doesn't. I'm not quite sure if he's made peace with his past, right? He's just going back to living a closeted life again. Maybe that again ties back to your father. What are your thoughts about like that character, and how did you get Mark to give that type of performance?
I appreciate the question because a lot of people at the campground had questions about who this guy was, and was he gay, or was he like a straight dude who was just kind of on safari or something. And as you can imagine, the campground is a place where people go to explore who they are. They're there to like look for partners, but a lot of them are just there to experience, summer in the woods. For a lot of gay people, gay and lesbian people, the woods became just kind of off limits. I mean, that's a combination of what they call metronormativity, right? That if you're a gay person growing up in a small town, you try to get to the cities. The cities are where you're going to find your boyfriends, your girlfriends. It's where you're going to live your life and be able to meet other people who are maybe not homophobic. But that has meant that a lot of gay people and lesbian people are kind of had to leave behind nature in the woods, right? And leave behind the land. And one of the things I've loved about Hillside and maybe even the other films that I've made, give you vistas of this kind of rural gay and lesbian identity, where small town life and rural life that's much quieter, that's much more about family, can still be capacious and allow for all the diversity of people's orientations and identities. You can think about that in so many different ways, or along racial lines or class lines. And anyhow, but the character of Carl, the main character in the film, like I was saying, a lot of people at the campground were like, what is his deal? Mark Rowe often plays fathers and, cops on television. He's had a really great career as a cameo and special guest star in many TV shows. But he's a gay person. He's often mistaken for straight. So that was one of the reasons I cast him, because I wanted someone who would almost have moved in the world as a father figure. Now he's a grandfather. No one would ever think about him maybe in a gay context. The other element that was really important to me about his character is he's really a romantic. So I think a lot of people expect that if you go to a gay campground in the woods, it's kind of a giant sex party. And definitely for some people who go to Hillside, it is. I know for myself, like I started going there before I made the film. I really enjoyed it there, probably because I was a Boy Scout and I just like camping and I like being outside and sitting in a fire. That's like a great way to spend my summer. And to be around other gay people who I live in a small town. I live in Ithaca. Carl is what I think of as a romantic. He is somebody who is looking for this love from his past that was so pure, and of course was also a love that kind of went away from him, got away from him. He was invited to come to Hillside with this long ago lover that he's looking for, and he said no because he was scared. He was probably 26, and just thought, why would I ever do that? That's like crazy. I would put my life at risk. Well, now he's regretting that decision, and so he's come to find him. And that quest narrative is a very romantic quest, right? He's like almost searching for this person from the past in the present. And the movie, in a way plays with that, right? You kind of get the sense that there's this, he's looking for a guy named Marty Cardona, and he shows up, and there's this sense that, oh, well, Marty's really changed. Like Marty's no longer this like super handsome, romantic guy that he met on this farm. No, he's now become this like leather daddy who is holding this giant party, and poor Carl has to feel like he's got to almost turn himself into somebody he's not, just to meet Marty where he is now. And that was one of the kind of comedic sleight of hands that I play in the film, is to sort of show these different sides of gay sexuality through Carl's almost imagination and his quest.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense, and I definitely appreciate. I was gonna you. It's almost like you're asking my questions, answering my questions before I asked. I was gonna ask about like a lot of portrayals, like you mentioned, of LGBTness in media tends to be very city centric, right? Like think about Rent, for example, here in New York, or anything based out in LA, or in SF, LA, Berkeley,
Queer as
right?
folk. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of reminds me of that. There's that Key and Peele skit of like there's like the one of them plays like the very flamboyant homosexual, and then he's like you're like your discriminatory is like, oh, he actually he's not an asshole, he's not a bigot, I'm the asshole, basically, like that kind of that's it kind of reminded me of that to some degree, right? There's like,
Well, you might remember there's a moment in Campfire when, as you talked about, Carl is experiencing some serious disappointment. He's lashing out at the guys that he's meeting for just being like only about sex. And he, rushes out of this party in a kind of dramatic way. And the response of the guys at the party is to applaud him like he just gave some diva performance on stage, instead of it being really a genuine heartbreak. And that's a fun moment in the movie for me. I did write that moment, but when you get with real people, because all those guys at the party are just guys at camp who are willing to be in the movie, they had their own ways that they wanted to add to that, and eye rolls, and just the funniness about gay life can be pretty ironic about emotion.
Yeah, but going back, right? So I was also a Boy Scout, right? And one of my family's traditions is, we always go back to. I'm from Florida, right? So I always go back to my parents for Florida. We've gone camping every Thanksgiving for like the last decade plus.
Oh, wow.
Also Boy Scout related reasons. Had to
Okay.
get those camping nights in to get the Eagle Scout. But yeah, I mean, again, it's very cool that there's and that there's a lot of this representation you have of kind of like the more rural nature side, right? And again, it goes back to your other films, right? Not only like Lavender Hill, right, was one of the ones you did, like one of your early films the same year you did Kill Your Darlings, which was a more straight up documentary about this LGBT commune in New York, right? And then again, you mentioned In the
Hmm.
Hollow, right? That takes place
Yeah.
in the Appalachian Trail.
Yeah.
Is there something again specific about nature in general, right? Not just specifically like LGBTness in nature, but just like nature in general that you like filming up in.
Many people have asked me that, Paulo, because this spring I did a screening. I was invited to do a screening of 3 of my short films
Mm,
because they were all about almost
mm,
LGBT people in nature and in the wild. And we called it Out Here. And people asked me, like, why, what is it that's drawing you to this material? And I'll admit that I don't know totally. I don't really have an answer except to say that I live in a pretty rural upstate area, and it's always been a value of mine to grow where I'm planted. I mean, this is where I live, so these are the stories that I'm hearing. And I'll also offer up that for other filmmakers who might be listening to this, nature in the wild provides a lot of like production value for zero cost, right? You get vistas, you get depth, you get threat, you get great light. And so if you're willing to brave it, and Making in the Hollow required sleeping on a cabin off the Appalachian Trail with no electricity and no bathroom. If you're willing to risk it and brave being outdoors, I think they're really beautiful films. I've always been really drawn to people who are able to make wonderful kind of nature-driven documentaries or films. Nomadland, good example. It's almost set inside an RV, but the rest of it is outdoors. She's in national parks and spending time with other people.
mm.
Beautiful twilights. I mean, that movie seems to be shot almost entirely at Magic Hour. I don't know how they did it. So that's funny, Paulo, about you and Boy Scouts and camping. So your family goes camping on Thanksgiving, you said.
Yeah, so it was that my dad's a doctor, right? So he didn't really have a lot of time off on the weekend. So in order to get the so many nights camping to get the camping merit badge or whatever, the weekend he would get off that was long enough for like an extended timeout would be the Thanksgiving weekend. And in
Got it.
Florida, it's too hot to go in the summer, right? So like the late November is kind of like the perfect time, and it just kind of started with just us, and then we started getting another couple more Filipino families to join us, and yeah,
Cool.
become a whole thing over the past couple of decades.
You know what's really interesting too? That well, first of all, I think that's an amazing story. I think there's also something about fathers and sons, and also men in the woods together. Like that's just so primal for me as a former Boy Scout, but also just generally, chopping wood or
Mm,
setting up camp, and the spirit of that like bonding that happens when you're kind of physically challenged, or in this case, he doesn't know anybody at this giant campground.
mm.
It's very hard, I think, for men to socialize and kind of step outside their comfort zone. They'd much rather be just by themselves, making a fire, which there is a scene in the movie where he's just making a fire. That's kind of all he has to do. Um,
I definitely related to that feeling of just make a fire. It'll all be good. Though
yeah.
I will say, as I've gotten a little bit older, and as my folks have gotten older, we've maybe started to like, oh, we'll go out to the campsite, but then half of us will go home for the night to sleep in the mattress. Um,
You live
I
in New York City, you said, right?
I live in New York City, yes.
So it's kind of challenging. There's not that much camping even that
Yeah,
close, right?
not
You
even
kind
that
of
close.
have
I
to
have to
get
go.
to
It's when I
Jersey.
go back to my folks in Florida.
Yeah.
I did notice another theme throughout your works, right? Obviously, we kind of talked about there's this LGBTQ, there's this nature theme, and
Yep.
also a bit of a LGBTQ intersection. But there's also right, like for example, your film Ascent, right, is not
Oh yeah.
specifically LGBT, but that's tied to the Redwood
Yeah.
protests, and
Yep.
then Ghosts, right, which you
Oh
directed
yeah.
with Jeffrey Palmer, was about the Kiowa boys who
Yeah.
fled the school. So again, there's obviously there's some element of to some degree being LGBT right in
Mm.
society is against the norm still to some degree, right? It is some sort of counterculture to some
Yeah.
degree, and even it's even Kill Your Darlings, right? Ties to the beach and the
Explicitly
racism,
so.
right?
Yeah.
Explicitly so. So again, what about what? Separate from the nature stuff, what draws you to make films about counterculture specifically, right? Even if it's
Mm.
outside of the LGBT specific space.
What I'll say here is, and by the way, Paolo, you're doing a great job, man. I feel so appreciated. Like you went and watched all these and know about them. Short films don't get a lot of love, it's wonderful to share them with friends, but They don't. It's not like a feature film that will be potentially have a big premiere and a red carpet. You don't. Unfortunately, they don't really have that same traction. So I really genuinely thank you guys on the death race trying to watch all this stuff and appreciate it all. I find myself really drawn to making films and telling stories about experience, meaning like the nature of experience, powerful experiences, characters going through transformational or cathartic moments in their life. I think that's just what I'm drawn to as a storyteller. So you mentioned Ascent, which is a short film about a young woman who climbs a redwood tree, and you don't really understand why, and really until the end. And that, I should say, was a kind of a piece of camera test for a feature film script that I had written that was about a young woman getting stuck on one of these tree sit platforms in a redwood tree and how she survives because she has no rope to get down. So it's really like a survival tale, like Castaway set 200 feet in the air up on a tree. So that was a story that's a pure experience. I've always been a fan of movies like that are survival tales. All Is Lost might be a good example, or Buried or something. Single character. Uh, Otherwise, like with Ghosts and some of the other, like Kill Your Darlings, might be connected here. Having been not just a journalist, but I'm really interested in the kind of history and the pressures of the pressures that characters and humans experienced before us that maybe we don't have now, but we can learn a lot from their response and their survival and resilience. So Kill Your Darlings is about really ultimately what we would call now a hate crime. Then was called a gay panic defense.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that one of my favorite writers, Allen Ginsberg, who himself became a real model of what it means to be a gay person in life, was involved with trying to help defend and help exonerate the guy who had done the killing, the guy who claimed this gay panic defense, just seemed so like rich and ironic to me that I had to work on that. That was a story that I had been thinking about for a long time. And my college roommate, incidentally, John Krokidas, had gone to NYU film school. And when he graduated, he was looking for a feature film to make. And so we started working on that script really in 2004. It took us 6 or 7 years to really get it financed and get it made. It took a long time. Then, and with Ghost, a similar story. Jeff Palmer is my colleague here at Cornell, a wonderful documentarian, Kiowa himself. And he had this idea for a story about the past and these boys who, decided that they would rather be free and risk dying than to live underneath the thumb of at that time a very white conservative culture that was trying to convert them into upstanding Americans. And that is also a feature film concept. We have a script for it, and Jeff is trying to raise the money for it because that story just continues to unfold. It's an amazing adventure tale, really for young people. It's like about, I think it's 15, 12, and 9 years old are the three main characters in Ghosts.
Yeah, they said at the end of the film, it was like, that's a story for another day, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, speaking of, right, I did want to ask one quick question about Kill Your Darling. So was that your first film you actually worked on?
It was the first produced film I'd made. I did make films in high school that were not very good. I did just get them converted from VHS.
No one counts those.
No one counts those, exactly. And then when I was in college, I started writing feature screenplays. I've always been really drawn to film and all kinds of writing, but I didn't have any friends who went into the film business. I graduated from college in the 90s. There weren't that many, cameras weren't that cheap, nothing like today. And so I just didn't have a lot of friends who went into film. So that sort of dream dwindled a little bit until, like I said, my college roommate went to NYU's film school, and then we started getting into film. And having that film made really did change my life and my career. I was able to work with different producers and have an opportunity to kind of really see how that industry works, and of course go to amazing film festivals and see amazing films. So I feel very lucky that was my first experience, was a movie like that I was so close to. It's not a very commercial film. It's not like I wrote it to sell. It was a passion project that was made on a nickel.
You won the International Days Award at Venice. So
I mean,
that
was pretty nice. We're pretty lucky.
Pretty nice.
There are lots of great stories though about great films like that. Past Lives would be an example this year. I really hope it ends up getting nominated for best film or best script because it's amazing, and it's that filmmaker's first time directing.
For what it's worth, I have it on my prediction list for getting a nomination this year. but going back to kill your darling, right? So
Yep.
what's the difference between working on this big feature length film that you said took 6 years to make versus something like Campfires? Now that you're 10 years or more into like your film career, right? Like
Yeah.
how, like, what's the difference between those two, and especially as you've gotten more mature in your career?
Well, the main thing, Paulo, is that I'm directing now, right? So
Yeah.
when I was a screenwriter on Kill Your Darlings, which was a great experience, John was a very inclusive director. I was a part of the edit, and we were just constantly talking about it, trying to make it as good as we could. But I wasn't directing, and I started to see, like, I met other directors, and I could see that many of them had great training technically, but they knew. I mean, it was always strange to me that screenwriters would write a script and hand it over to somebody else when you spent all the time building it up and creating the world, and you give it to somebody else who has no real relationship to it except they want to make it. That didn't make a lot of sense to me. So I started making my own work. And as you know, making a documentary is a lot easier than making a fiction film in some ways, because you don't have to worry nearly as much about the acting talent, the production value. You can work with cameras that are a little bit less, souped up, and you're not going to be necessarily having to recolor everything. You don't need to worry about costumes and props, etc. So documentary has been this, like, kind of gateway drug for me. And then, as you've seen, like, my career, I keep kind of making more and more narrative, adding more and more narrative into the documentary as I'm kind of building up the confidence. And my goal is to really, within the next couple of years, direct a feature film. And the challenge there, though, which is, it's kind of fun to talk to somebody like you who you do see a lot of films. The film industry is still really evolving radically, and that independent film world that I knew and came up with in New York City
Yeah.
is really changing, right? Like, in the era of streamers, you just don't
I have
see.
I have a
Yeah,
whole separate podcast about box office numbers, and so yeah, I totally know what you're talking about as well. Which that actually brings me to another question, right? How is it? Obviously, right? Like when you're writing, right? Let's focus on the writing for a second. When you're
great.
writing a nonfiction, a fiction story, right? Even if it's based on something nonfiction, like Kill Your
Yep,
Darlings, or
yep.
even In the Hollow, right? You have and even here in Campfire, you have like the fiction elements, which you're creating from scratch, right? You as the person, you come up with the idea in your head and put it out onto the page. How does that differ from writing, quote unquote, a documentary, right? Because when I've done some documentary-esque podcasts before, and that was mostly me. I have some questions I'll ask them, but I find the story in their answers, and then post answers, I end up finding the story. Do you write anything before, or what's your process for, quote unquote, writing nonfiction versus fiction?
You raise a really interesting question here too, around, like, the role of writing inside documentary. And I think a lot of students confuse thinking, like, oh, that you've, like, written the scene, or you somehow put the words in the person's mouth. But instead it kind of works the other way, where you, as you said, you interview people, and then you identify the key story beats or the selections, and you sort of sculpt from that material. So it's a little bit more like after the fact instead of before, like a screenplay where you have written all the dialogue. Um, so oof, this Campfire was unique in that I had started doing all these interviews, like, about mid-May, mid-June, late June. I had maybe, I don't know, let's say 12 to 15 different interviews with people. And while I hadn't done any of the transcriptions to really understand what the key pieces of dialogue were, I knew, like, for example, that there was this location on camp called the Green Gate that everybody seemed to mention, that there was this threshold that they passed from the regular world into this brigadoon of the campground where they could kind of be whoever they wanted to be and self-express. So in my head, when I sat to write the script, and there really was a script for Campfire, I was like, oh, I got to make sure that this guy opens this gate and, like, has a moment where he thinks about, like, what's on the other side of this gate.
Mhm.
Oh, wait, maybe I should just start it at the gate. And then I just had this sense that if I went through the documentary material, which I ended up doing, I would find some linkage, and it turned out to be the campground administrator crying as he talked about how important the Great Gate was to him and to the people that he knew. And I was like, I got to put this in. So finding those linkages was really the art form of the edit. I'll say one more thing too. In the script, well, let me back up even further. When I used to go to the campground just on my own to have fun and, like, drink beer and meet people, make friends,
Make
there
campfires.
was, yeah, exactly. There's a place at the in the campground called the Memorial Garden,
Right.
and it was one of my favorite places. It's like a place where there's kind of what am I looking for? Tombstones and remembrances, and people have definitely sprinkled ashes there of the people that have gone there, and people's lovers and partners who have died. There are many names there from the AIDS era who died, who would go there as a kind of refuge from the city, but then ended up dying. And it just was a very meaningful place. It's like it's a cemetery in the middle of this party campground. So when I was writing the film, the screenplay, I was like, I gotta set something there because I really believe in it. The script that I wrote, Carl is taken there by this other campground, a guy, a perm as I call him. But in the script, I was like, I don't think Carl's ready to go to this campground. I think that seems like sorry, not campground, cemetery. That seems a little bit too high stakes, like emotionally for him. Well, then when we got there, and the actors, who are both gay men, were like, I'm not going to stop here. I'm going into this cemetery. Like, this character would need to do that. They spoke as human beings, right? Like, both as the character and as gay people. So then he walks into the character Carl walks into the cemetery, and that becomes, in a way, the crescendo of the movie, because you start to get this sense of like the history of loss that's happened here, and that feeling of the past kind of emerging into the present. Anyway, so to answer your question, there is this, like, how to put it, like symbiotic relationship between listening to the world, kind of thinking about what people have said, how that relates to maybe the story that I want to tell. So when I wrote the screenplay, it was very much inflected with the stories, but not like verbatim, just, oh, those two naked guys that I interviewed, they seemed like they met there, they fell in love there. Well, that's kind of what Carl wants. So I feel like I'm going to have to put them in this somewhere. So I'll just have them walk around, and we'll put them in the background, and then maybe they'll say something, and they did. And then you had to just be open to the experience, and the documentary experience of the making. That's the last part, where let's see where the story goes if this character does say yes instead of no. And I'm proud of what happened, because thank God it gave me a climax in a way that I didn't have otherwise.
Yeah, it sounds almost like what they say directors are like, trust your actors, right? Let the actors improv a little bit to some degree, which in a way probably maybe is more similar to what what writers do, right? What documentary writers do, where they like go again, let the interviews lead whatever the narrative you want to craft from the interviews.
Oh man, completely. I one of the great privileges of working with good actors, and you just see where their mind goes. They know the characters better than I do. There was a moment in the script where, like, it was a party, and Carl meets this other guy who's like a member of the campground, and I wrote some dialogue for these two guys, kind of hitting it off. Maybe there's a little spark there, but it's always different between two people, especially when you cast somebody. And so the actor that I cast, who was a non-actor, by the way, George Hawksworth, loved the experience of being in the film. He came up with all these great one-liners about, like, how you might flirt with somebody, and so I put every single one of those in there, and I feel kind of proud of the way that it came together, because it feels alive on screen. You're watching two people who are just human beings, and they're kind of into each other, and that's what you get.
Yeah, it felt authentic for sure. And and again, your choice of doing the mix of documentary and and fiction, right, kind of informing each other, I think is also a benefit, right? It lets you write a more compelling script, I think, as a result.
I hope so. I mean, this German woman said she was super irritated by it, but again, I'm not sure she meant irritated. I will say one thing, given that we're on this Death Race podcast, I do feel like the Academy categories of documentary and live action are very strict. So I knew that even though our film was lucky enough to be, I submitted it to the Academy portal, we won a prize at the Provincetown Film Festival, so we were able to do that. Like, we were up for Oscar contention. Yeah. But I always knew that I was like, there's no way this is going to go any further, because they want really strict, like, live action. This is a total script that was produced, or this is a documentary which was not written. And so anyway, I didn't have much hope for it, but it was fun. It was a great honor. I'm excited to see what they do choose.
Yeah, for sure. And then, last question, because we're a little bit over half an hour now.
Okay,
don't want to take up too much time, but this is the last question about representation, right? So obviously, right, a lot of your films, a lot of your projects, deal with LGBTQ themes. They've been submitted. They've won awards at various LGBT film festivals or at film festivals for LGBTQ representation. I myself, I'm Asian American, right? And so with the rise of Asian American cinema, I've been thinking a lot about, hey, like, I want to have, like, there's almost like I've heard it called rep sweats, where, like, you want to represent for a film that's supporting, for in my case, Asian Americans. It might not be the best film, right? And what's your, I guess what I'm getting at is, at what point, right, do you want your films to always be seen as LGBTQ themed films, or do you want to have films that are just good films, right? I'm also thinking, for example, American Fiction. I don't know if you've seen that yet.
No, I
Um,
want to.
the question there, right, for that Monk, the main character in the film, faces is, I'm an African American writer, but I write nothing about the African American experience, but I still get put in African American studies in the bookstore, right? So where do you think, there's obviously importance in representation, but
Yeah.
also not wanting to be pigeonholed to this specific kind of work.
Oh,
What,
yeah.
what are your thoughts on that, specifically for, I guess, the LGBTQ
It's,
side of
it's
things?
really, it's funny. I think about it. Sometimes I think about it a lot, and other times I find myself not thinking about it at all. I have found that I've written a lot of different things in my life, some of which are very autobiographically inflected, some of which are more aligned with that LGBT identity because I'm a gay person, or they have nothing to do with that. And the stuff that seems to have traction, or the stuff that people like still like want to think about, or whatever has gone to film festivals, is the stuff that has this LGBT focus. And when I made Campfire, in my head, I thought, I really want to play straight film festivals because there are a number of gay and lesbian film festivals which are really awesome, Outfest or Inside Out. And then there's places like the Cleveland Film Festival or Aspen or Sundance that don't have an LGBT focus particularly. And that seemed to be what I targeted. And the truth is, the film did have a certain life at what I would call straight or like non-identity driven film festivals like Cleveland, where it premiered. But many of the gay film festivals that I've loved and I've gone to many times didn't accept it. It didn't play at Outfest. It didn't play it Inside Out. And I think it's because the movie is about, if I had to guess, if I was being really cynical, the movie is about like older middle age, gay male issues, which to many programmers who are younger, probably a lot of them are pretty intersectional in terms of identity. Trans issues are really the like in their moment right now, and so a lot of film festivals I think leaned into those kinds of narratives, people exploring gender nonconforming identities. And a masculinist middle-aged man might seem really kind of how to put it, a little older or dated as a story exploration. So at the moment I'm working on a script that has it basically is like a crime thriller. It's a genre I love. Blue Ruins, one of my favorite films. I love that kind of really pulpy, intense, streamlined kind of narrative, regional, like One False Move might be another example if you know that one. And that has nothing to do with LGBT identity at all. If anything, it's about my single mom. And the main character is a middle-aged woman who's a single parent. And so I'm kind of like channeling this autobiographical experience. And maybe that's where I'd leave it, is that I just find myself drawn to films and filmmakers who have some autobiographical or personal tether to their material. I think we all know that there are a lot of films and filmmakers who are just in the game and know how to get access to money, but there's nothing connecting them to their material. And then there's some filmmakers who can make amazing films that have no personal connection to it. Like I don't think Nomadland, I don't think Chloe Zhao knows much about the life of a middle-aged woman in the American West living out of an RV, but she's an amazing empath, and you've seen that from her other movies like The Rider. So I guess I'm trying to write from a personal autobiographical perspective in the most exciting and expansive way possible, and also be as empathetic as possible. And this is the world I live in. I live in a kind of rural area, so I'm listening to these stories, and these are the ones that compel me.
It will influence you, and those are
Yeah,
stories that you're equipped to tell.
yeah, I hope so. Yeah, that's the idea.
Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure, Austin. Again, I loved watching Campfire. I loved watching all of your short films and Kill My Darling. So definitely recommend, not just watching Campfire, but all the other stuff. Kill Your Darling is on HBO Max. I watched it this morning.
That's right. I know.
So
Amazing.
yeah, so definitely go check those out if you're listening to this. But thank you once again for the interview. Thank you again for submitting to the Death Race Film Festival, and looking forward to seeing your next projects come out in the future.
Fantastic, Paulo. Thank you. I really appreciate you doing this interview.
Of course, thank you.